In the autumn of 1879, on a damp Wednesday morning in the third week of October, a young architectural surveyor named James Hadlow was riding a small grey horse along a narrow road that ran through the hill country of central Northumberland, in the high northeastern country of England. He was 28 years old. He was the third son of a careful middle-class family in London. His father had been a clerk in a small banking house. His two older brothers had gone into law and into the church, respectively. James, who had shown a particular ability with figures and a particular love for old buildings since he had been a boy, had been articled at 16 to a careful, well-respected firm of architectural surveyors in the city of London. Hadlow having no money, but having 2 introductions from his father, and had spent the 12 years since learning the careful, patient work of looking at very old buildings and telling the people who owned them what they would need to do to keep the buildings standing for the next 100 years. He was, in the autumn of his 28th year, on his first independent commission. The firm had sent him north to a manor house in central Northumberland called Marston Hall, on the request of the young Lord Marston, who had inherited the place the previous spring, and who had written to the firm asking for a careful survey of the building's condition before he embarked on the restoration he had planned for it. The road was narrow and worn. The country to either side was the bare brown autumn country of the Northumbrian uplands, short grass going dark in the cold, patches of dark heather, small scattered hawthorns going leafless, the occasional dark stone wall running across the open country in the long, careful lines of an older boundary that no one quite remembered anymore. The sky had been heavy grey since dawn. The first thin rain of an October afternoon had begun half an hour back, and James had pulled his hood up and had bent forward over the horse's neck against it, in the careful way of a man who had not been a horseman by birth, but had become one of necessity. He had come up by train from London the previous day to the small market town of Hexham. He had hired the horse at the inn that morning. He had been told by the careful old man at the inn who had hired the horse to him that Marston Hall was perhaps 4 hours' ride into the hill country, out the western road, then north at the small village of Allendale, then along the high road that ran up into the open moors. He had been told also that the road was easy enough, but that the country was empty, and that he should not stop along the way except at the small public house at the village of Allendale, because there was nothing else for many miles. He had ridden out. He had reached Allendale at the end of the morning. He had stopped at the small public house. He had eaten a small meal of cold meat and bread and a small mug of dark ale. He had asked the woman who had served him whether she knew Marston Hall and how far it was and what kind of place it was. She had been a careful older woman of perhaps 50, in a worn dark wool dress and a clean white apron. She had stopped when he had asked her about Marston Hall. She had looked at him for a moment in a careful way he had not, in the moment, known what to make of. She had said, in her quiet voice, that yes, she knew Marston Hall. She had said it was perhaps 2 hours further on. She had said it was a large old place. She had said, in the careful private way of a country woman of her generation, that the family up at the Hall had had a difficult inheritance. James had asked, in his careful young man's way, what she had meant by that. She had said only, "The Marstons have been a careful family, sir. They have kept their own counsel for a long time. It is not for me to say." She had not said more. James had paid for his meal and had ridden on. The road north of Allendale climbed slowly into the higher country. The villages thinned. The country opened. By 2 in the afternoon he had been in the open moors, with the first thin rain of the day beginning to fall and no shelter visible in any direction. The grey horse had begun to slow, in the careful way of a horse that had been worked 4 hours and was beginning to feel it. James had ridden on patiently, trusting the careful old man at the inn's directions, watching the slow grey rain come down across the empty country. He had reached Marston Hall at the end of the afternoon, in the failing grey light of an October dusk in the high country. The hall sat in a shallow valley between two long brown slopes, perhaps a mile from the high road, at the end of a long, worn track that ran down through a stand of dark Scots pines. James had reined the horse in at the top of the track and had looked down at the place for some time before riding down to it. It was a substantial old manor, 3 stories, in the heavy grey stone of the country, with a long west-facing front and 2 wings extending back at right angles to form a partial courtyard at the rear. The roof was dark slate. The chimneys were tall. There were perhaps 20 windows on the front face, in the regular, careful pattern of a building that had been added to in stages over several centuries, and had eventually been brought to a consistent face by a long-dead Marston of the previous century. The house was set behind a low stone wall, with a small careful courtyard of worn flagstones in front of the main entrance, and a small careful gravel drive running up to the door. A few of the windows in the front face were lit, in the warm amber gold of oil lamps and small fires. The rest were dark. The west-facing front was, James saw at once, the front of a house that was occupied, the lit windows in the regular places, the small smoke from one of the chimneys, the small careful sounds of a household at the end of an afternoon. The eastern wing, behind the house, was different. James could see only the end of it from the top of the track, the long, narrow extension running back from the rear of the main house, 2 stories, in the same heavy grey stone, but visibly older, with the small rough windows of an earlier century. None of the windows in the eastern wing were lit. The chimneys of the eastern wing were not smoking. The wing was, in the failing afternoon light, entirely dark, a long, quiet, darker mass at the back of the otherwise lit house. He rode down the track. The grey horse picked its way carefully through the dark pines. By the time he reached the front door of the hall, the rain had thickened, and the small, careful evening sounds of the household had been replaced by the steadier sound of the rain on the slate roofs and the worn flagstones. He dismounted. He walked the horse to the small stable at the side of the courtyard, where an older man, the household groom, had appeared with a careful small lantern to take the horse from him. James had handed over the reins. He had taken his small leather travelling bag and the larger leather case that held his surveyor's instruments and notebooks. He had walked across the worn flagstones to the heavy oak front door. He had knocked. The door had been opened, after a few moments, by a careful older woman in a heavy dark wool dress, and a small white linen cap of the kind country housekeepers had worn for 50 years. She had been perhaps 60. She had a steady, weathered face with the small, careful lines of a woman who had spent her life running a quiet household. She had looked at James for a moment before speaking, the same careful look the woman at the public house had given him that morning, and had then said in a quiet, steady voice, "You will be Mr. Hadlow, sir. From London. We have been expecting you. Please come in." He had stepped into the entry hall. The entry hall of Marston Hall was a large square room with a heavy stone floor, dark oak panelling on the walls, and a great open hearth on the western wall in which a careful small fire was burning. A heavy old grandfather clock stood in the corner. A few careful old portraits hung on the panelling. 3 or 4, no more. All of them men in the dress of various periods of the last 2 centuries, all of them in the careful, steady way of family portraits painted by competent provincial artists. A heavy oak staircase rose at the back of the hall to the upper floors. James had set down his bags. The housekeeper, who had introduced herself as Mrs. Cawthorne, had taken his wet cloak and had hung it on a peg by the door. She had said that Lord Marston was at the moment in his small library at the back of the hall, and that he had asked to be told the moment Mr. Hadlow arrived. She had said that she would let him know. She had said that in the meantime she would show James to his room, where he could wash and change before being introduced to the household. James had thanked her. They had climbed the staircase to the first floor. His room was at the front of the house, on the eastern side, with a small mullioned window looking out over the small courtyard. It was a careful, comfortable room, in the way the careful, comfortable guest rooms of country manor houses were a heavy old four-poster bed, a small fire already lit in the grate, a small wooden writing desk and chair, a heavy oak wardrobe, a small washstand with a porcelain basin and ewer of warm water. Mrs. Cawthorne had told him that dinner would be at 7, that the household was small, and that she would come for him at 6:45 to bring him down to the small drawing-room where Lord Marston would be waiting. She had withdrawn. James had washed. He had changed into the cleaner of his 2 travelling suits, the small, careful dark wool suit a young surveyor wore when he was meeting a client of rank for the first time. He had spent the half-hour before Mrs. Cawthorne returned for him sitting at the small writing desk, looking out the small mullioned window at the rain falling steadily on the worn courtyard flagstones and the dark stables beyond, and thinking carefully about what the woman at the public house had said. The Marstons have been a careful family, sir. They have kept their own counsel for a long time. He had not, at that point in the evening, attached any particular weight to what she had said. Mrs. Cawthorne had returned at 6:45. She had brought him down the stair and across the entry hall to a small comfortable drawing-room at the back of the house, where the young Lord Marston had been waiting. Lord Charles Marston was 31 years old. He was a tall, slim, well-made man with close-cropped, dark hair, a clean-shaven face of the careful, intelligent type James had come to know in his work. The modern face, in the way the men of their generation had begun to call it, the face of a man who had been to Oxford and had read his Mill and his Tennyson, and had returned to take his inheritance with a head full of ideas about what he was going to do with it. He had stood up from the chair by the fire when James had come in, and had crossed the room to shake his hand with the open, friendly manner of a young man who genuinely intended to be welcoming. He had been wearing a heavy dark wool dinner jacket and a quiet dark cravat. He had thanked James for making the long ride out from Hexham. He had apologized for the weather. He had asked after James's brothers, whom he had heard mentioned by the senior partner at the firm. He had gestured to the careful older woman who had been sitting on the other side of the fire, and had introduced her as his mother, the Dowager Lady Marston, who had moved across the room to take James's hand with the same careful, steady look Mrs. Cawthorne had given him at the front door. The Dowager was perhaps 58. She was a small, careful, slim woman in a quiet, dark wool dress, with grey-brown hair drawn into a low, careful knot at the nape of her neck, and the small, steady eyes of a woman who had spent a long time looking carefully at things. She had said only that she was glad to meet James, and that she hoped he would find Marston Hall to his liking, and that she was sure he would do the careful work the family needed. There had been a 4th person in the room, a heavier older man, perhaps 70, in a worn, dark country tweed and a small, dark waistcoat. He had been sitting in the second armchair by the fire, with a small glass of something dark in his hand, and had not stood when James had come in. Lord Marston had introduced him as his great-uncle, Hubert Marston, his grandfather's younger brother, who lived at the Hall and had done so for most of his long life. The great-uncle had nodded to James from the armchair. He had said only in a slow, steady voice, "Mr. Hadlow, you have ridden a long way today." James had said yes, he had. The great-uncle had said, "It is a long ride out from Hexham. You will be tired." James had said he was, a little. The great-uncle had said, "It is a long ride to a long house, a great deal to look at. You will need your strength tomorrow." James had not, in the moment, known quite what to make of that. The young Lord Marston had said, with a small, easy laugh, that his great-uncle was inclined to make all small remarks sound prophetic, and that James should not pay it any mind. The Dowager had not laughed. She had only looked briefly at the great-uncle in a way that James had registered without entirely understanding. Dinner had been served at 7 in the small dining-room beside the drawing-room. There had been 4 at the table, Lord Marston, the Dowager, the great-uncle and James. The food had been the careful country food of a quiet household, a clear soup, a small piece of roast mutton, potatoes, parsnips, a small dish of cold custard. The conversation had been the careful, polite conversation of a household receiving a guest of rank equal but not intimate. Talk of the journey, talk of London, talk of the country roads, talk of the autumn weather and the prospects for winter. The young Lord Marston had spoken most. He had been, James saw at once, a charming, intelligent man who genuinely wanted to be welcoming. He had asked careful questions about James's training and the firm's work. He had asked about other manor houses in the north that James had surveyed. He had told James, in his open, friendly way, that he had inherited Marston Hall in March of that year on the death of his father, and that he had spent the spring and summer beginning to think about what he wanted to do with the place. He had said, "It is a substantial old house, Mr. Hadlow. There is more of it than is currently in use." James had asked what he had meant by that. Lord Marston had said, "The eastern wing has been closed up for many years. I would like to bring it back into use. That is part of what I would like you to assess." James had glanced, automatically, at the dowager. She had not been looking at her son. She had been looking at her plate, in the careful, steady way of a woman who had heard a thing said many times and had ceased to react to it. The great uncle Hubert had set down his fork and had said nothing, but had looked at the young Lord Marston in the slow, steady way of a man who was carefully not commenting. James, who had been a good surveyor for 12 years, and had become a good surveyor partly by being a careful observer of the small reactions of his clients and their households, had said only, in his careful young man's way, that he would assess everything Lord Marston wished him to assess. Lord Marston had smiled. He had said, "Excellent, Mr. Hadlow. We will start in the morning." The conversation had moved on. James had been taken back upstairs by Mrs. Cawthorne at 9:30. He had spent perhaps an hour, sitting at the small writing desk in his room, making his careful preliminary notes from what he had observed of the building so far, the entry hall, the staircase, the drawing room, the dining room, the small careful patterns of damp at the corners of the windows where the rain had been blowing in. He had gone to bed at 10:30. He had slept the careful, tired sleep of a young man who had ridden a long way, and was beginning to feel that the careful work of the next several days was going to be more interesting than he had expected. In the morning, James had begun his survey. He had spent the whole of the first day on the western range and the front of the house. Lord Marston had walked with him for the first hour, pointing out the things he had wanted James to look at, and had then left him to his work with the open, friendly assurance of a client who trusted his surveyor to know what he was doing. James had spent the rest of the morning and the afternoon walking the western range room by room, taking his careful measurements, making his careful notes, looking at the careful old roof from the small attic spaces, looking at the careful old foundations from the cold, dim cellars below. The house was, in the language of his trade, in good condition for its age. The roof had been reslated in the previous generation and had perhaps 15 more years before it would need work. The window frames on the western front were beginning to need attention, but were not urgent. The drainage around the foundations was good. The cellars were dry. The interior wood was sound. Marston Hall, on the western range, was a careful, well-maintained old house, in the kind of careful, well-maintained condition that suggested a long line of careful Marstons who had taken its upkeep seriously. He had come back to the small dining room for dinner at 7, in the same careful, friendly company as the night before. Lord Marston had asked, over dinner, how he was getting on. James had said the western range was in excellent condition. Lord Marston had said he was glad. He had said that the next day James should begin on the eastern wing. James had said yes. He had said he would begin in the morning. The dowager had, at that moment, looked at her son for the first time across the table. She had not said anything. She had only, very briefly, looked at him. Lord Marston had not noticed. He had been telling James about a piece of news from London. After dinner, when Lord Marston had gone to his small library, and James had been about to climb the stair to his room. Mrs. Cawthorne had stopped him at the foot of the stair. She had said in her quiet voice, "Mr. Hadlow, I would like a word with you, sir, if I may. Perhaps tomorrow morning before you begin, at 8 o'clock, in the small kitchen." James had said yes, of course. He had thought, climbing the stair, that this was an unusual thing for a housekeeper to ask of a guest of the house, but he had thought also that she had asked it in the steady, careful way of a woman who had thought carefully about whether to ask, and that it was probably better to let her say what she wanted to say than to wonder what it was. He had been in the small kitchen at 8 in the morning, as she had asked. The kitchen had been quiet. The cook had been at the back of the kitchen, at the great range, in the careful, absorbed way of a country cook beginning the day's work, and had not been listening. Mrs. Cawthorne had been at the small, worn wooden table in the centre of the kitchen, with a small cup of tea before her, and had risen when James had come in. She had said, "Sit down, Mr. Hadlow, will you have tea?" He had sat down. She had poured him a cup. They had sat across the small wooden table from each other for perhaps a minute in silence, in the small, steady quiet of a country kitchen at 8 in the morning. She had said, finally, "Mr. Hadlow, I have been the housekeeper at Marston Hall for 31 years. I came to the house when I was 29. I have served 3 Lord Marstons in those years. I am 60 years old. There are not many things at this house that I do not know." She had paused. She had taken a small sip of her tea. She had said, "His lordship has asked you to look at the eastern wing. He intends to have it restored. He intends, I believe, to have the wall taken down." She had paused. She had looked at James across the small wooden table. She had said, "Mr. Hadlow, the wall in the eastern wing was built in the year 1782. It was built by Sir Reginald Marston, the great-grandfather of the present Lord Marston. It has stood for 97 years. It has been kept standing for 97 years by every Lord Marston who has lived in this house since Sir Reginald, because Sir Reginald, who was a careful and a steady man, asked his son and his son's son, and so on for as long as the family lived in this house to please not take it down." She had paused. She had said, "His lordship knows this. He has been told it many times, by his mother, by his great-uncle, by me when he was a boy, before he understood that I was not a person whose word mattered to him." She had said, "He intends to take it down anyway. He believes, in his careful young man's way, that the family stories are old superstitions, and that the wall is a piece of old family stupidity that should be removed so that the eastern wing can be brought back into use." She had paused. She had said, "Mr. Hadlow, I am asking you, as the man whose report his lordship will read, to look at the wall when you survey the eastern wing today, to look at it carefully, to make your own judgment about it, and to write your report, when you write it, in such a way that his lordship cannot, in good conscience, take the wall down on the basis of your survey." She had stopped speaking. James had been silent for a moment. He had said in his careful young man's way, "Mrs. Cawthorne, I cannot do that. My report has to be a true report of the building's condition. If the wall is sound, I have to say so. I cannot recommend its preservation on grounds outside my professional remit." She had nodded slowly. She had said, "I understand that, sir. I am not asking you to lie. I am asking you to look at the wall and at what is behind it, and to think carefully before you write your report about what your professional remit really is." She had said, "There are things in this house that are not, perhaps, the kind of things a young surveyor expects to find in his work. The wall is one of them. Sir Reginald built it for a reason. The reason still applies. Lord Charles does not understand the reason because Lord Charles has not lived in this house long enough to understand it. His mother understands. His great-uncle understands. The two of them have asked his lordship not to take the wall down. He has not listened to them. He may listen to you. That is what I am asking." She had paused. She had said, "If, after you have surveyed the eastern wing today, you do not understand what I am talking about, then write your report as you would write any report, and I will not say another word to you. But if you understand, when you have seen. I will ask you only to remember, when you write, that the eastern wing has been closed for 97 years, and that the family has known why, and that what Lord Charles is asking you to authorize is the opening of something that 4 generations of careful Marstons have kept closed. She had finished her tea. She had stood up. She had said only, "Thank you for hearing me, sir. The cook will have your breakfast for you in the small dining room. I will not detain you longer." She had left the kitchen. James had sat at the small wooden table for some minutes after she had gone, looking at his cup of tea. He had thought, in those minutes, several things. He had thought that he was a young surveyor on his first independent commission. He had thought that he had been hired by Lord Marston, and that Lord Marston was the client, and that Lord Marston's instructions were what he was professionally bound to follow. He had thought that the housekeeper was probably an old retainer who believed old family stories, that the modern man should not be expected to take seriously. He had thought also, in those minutes, that Mrs. Cawthorne was a careful, steady woman who had spoken to him in the careful, steady way of a woman who had thought carefully about what to say, and had said it because she believed it. He had thought that the dowager's brief look at her son across the dinner table the night before had been the same kind of look. He had thought that the great uncle's "You will need your strength tomorrow" had meant something he had not, at the time, understood. He had thought that he would do as Mrs. Cawthorne had asked. He would look at the wall carefully and at what was behind it, and he would think about it before he wrote his report. He had risen. He had gone to the small dining room. He had eaten his breakfast. He had begun his survey of the eastern wing at 9:30. The eastern wing was reached, from the main body of the house, through a small dark corridor that ran east from the back of the main hall. The corridor was perhaps 30 feet long. It was panelled in the same dark oak as the entry hall. It had 3 small doors on the south side opening into storerooms that were currently in use, and 1 heavy oak door at the far end. The heavy oak door at the far end, which had a careful old iron lock and a careful old iron handle, was the door into the eastern wing. James had unlocked it with the heavy iron key Lord Marston had given him at breakfast. He had pushed it open. He had stepped through. The eastern wing was cold. The air had the particular, still quiet cold of a part of a building that had been closed up for a long time and had, even in the careful, well-maintained way of Marston Hall, taken on the slow, careful quietness of an unused space. The corridor on the other side of the door was narrow and dark. The walls were the same heavy grey stone as the rest of the house, but visibly older, the stones rougher, the joins less regular, the careful surface rendering that had been applied to the rest of the house never having been applied here. James had taken the small oil lamp Mrs. Cawthorne had given him at breakfast and had lit it. He had walked slowly down the corridor. The corridor ran perhaps 40 feet east. There were 3 doors on the north side, opening into rooms that James had glanced into briefly. A small old library with the books still on the shelves, a small old sitting room with the furniture still under heavy white dust cloths, a small old bedroom with the bed stripped to its frame. The rooms had the careful preserved feel of rooms that had not been used in a long time, but that had been respected, not abandoned, not allowed to fall into ruin, but quietly maintained at the level of careful preservation. At the end of the corridor, the wing turned to the south. The corridor continued perhaps another 20 feet, with 2 more doors on the east side, before reaching the wall. The wall was unmistakable. It was a wall of dark red brick, set into the older grey stone of the wing, blocking the corridor entirely from floor to ceiling. The brickwork was careful. It had been done by a careful mason, not in a hurry, with the small, careful attention of a man who had been told that the wall mattered. James, as a surveyor, could see at once that the wall had been built in 1782 by a man who had wanted it to last. He had set down his lamp on the corridor floor. He had taken out his notebook and his pencil. He had begun to make his careful notes. The wall was perhaps 8 feet wide and 10 feet high. It had been built tight against the older stone of the wing on either side and on top. The mortar joins had been carefully sealed. There was no door in the wall, no window, no small careful access panel. The wall had been built to seal the corridor entirely. Whatever was on the other side of it had been intended to stay on the other side of it. He had measured the wall. He had checked the mortar. He had checked the barned pattern. He had checked the foundations at the base. The wall was, in the language of his trade, a piece of careful, competent professional masonry that had been built to last and had lasted. It was sound. It was not going anywhere. It would stand, with the small, careful attention any old wall needed, for another 200 years if required. It had not occurred to him, until he had finished his careful surveyor's notes about the wall itself, to ask the next question, which was, what is on the other side of the wall? He had stood in the cold, dark corridor for some minutes, with his small oil lamp at his feet and his notebook in his hand, looking at the careful old brickwork. He had thought about Mrs. Cawthorne's words at breakfast. He had thought that, as a surveyor, he had a perfectly good professional reason for wanting to know what was on the other side of the wall, namely, that he was being asked to authorize its removal, and that he could not properly assess that unless he understood what the wall was containing. He had thought also that the eastern wing was a substantial structure. The corridor he was standing in was perhaps 60 feet long in total. The wall at the end of it sealed off, by his preliminary calculation from outside, perhaps another 40 feet of corridor and at least 4 further rooms in the further part of the wing. There was an entire substantial section of the manor house behind this wall. He had thought about how he might see what was there. There were no windows in the eastern wing visible from outside. He had looked. The end of the wing and the wall along the southern face of it were entirely blank. No windows, no doors, only the careful grey stone of the older masonry. Whatever was on the other side of the wall could not be seen from outside, but the wing was 2 stories. The wall in the corridor he was standing in was on the ground floor. There was, by the regular pattern of the manor, an upper floor above this corridor, and the upper floor of the eastern wing might not have been walled off. He had picked up his lamp. He had walked back down the corridor to the main body of the house. He had climbed the small staircase at the back of the house to the first floor. He had walked along the upper corridor to the door that led into the upper level of the eastern wing. The door was unlocked. He had pushed it open. The upper corridor of the eastern wing ran in the same pattern as the lower one. It was the same grey stone, the same narrow, dim space, with the same arrangement of careful old rooms opening from it. James had walked slowly down it, with his lamp in his hand, until he had reached the corner where the wing turned south. Above the lower wall, there was no wall. The upper corridor continued. It ran perhaps another 20 feet south. There were 2 doors on the east side. There was, at the very end of the corridor, a small narrow stair going down. James had stopped at the top of the small narrow stair. He had stood there for some time. The stair was narrow and steep. The treads were the same heavy grey stone as the rest of the wing. The walls of the stairwell were the same older grey stone. At the bottom, perhaps 15 feet below, the small narrow stair opened into the further corridor. The corridor on the other side of the wall, on the ground floor, that the wall had been built to seal off. He could see, by the small light of his lamp held over the stairwell, the floor at the bottom. It was the same heavy grey stone of the corridor. The corridor at the bottom ran a short distance south, and then opened into what looked like a small chamber. He had looked at the small narrow stair. He had thought that he could go down it. He had thought that he had a professional reason to. He had thought that he had Lord Marston's commission to assess the eastern wing, and that he could not assess it without seeing all of it, and that the small narrow stair was the only way to see the part of it that the wall sealed off from the corridor below. He had thought that Mrs. Cawthorne had asked him that morning to look at the wall and at what was behind it. He had begun, very slowly, to descend the small narrow stair. He went down perhaps halfway. He stopped on the 7th tread. It had been at that point, on the 7th tread of the small narrow stair, that he had understood, without being able to put what he understood into words at the time, and without being able to say afterwards exactly what he had felt, that he should not go further. He had not heard anything. He had not seen anything. There had been no sound from the corridor below, no movement of air, no smell, no specific particular thing that a careful surveyor's notebook could have recorded. He had only stood on the 7th tread, with his small oil lamp in his right hand and his notebook in his left, in the cold quiet of the small narrow stairwell, and had understood that he should turn around and climb back up. The understanding had not been a fearful one, in the way fear was usually understood. It had been a quiet, steady understanding, in the way one might understand that one should not walk further out onto a frozen pond. The pond had not, in any visible way, indicated that it was unsafe. One had only known. He had turned around. He had climbed slowly back up the 7 treads. He had stepped back into the upper corridor of the eastern wing. He had closed the small wooden door at the top of the stair. He had walked back down the upper corridor to the door that led to the main house. He had passed through it. He had walked back to the staircase at the back of the main house and had descended to the ground floor. He had walked through the entry hall and into the small drawing room at the back of the house, where Lord Marston had been at his writing desk. Working through his correspondence, Lord Marston had looked up. He had said, "Hadlow, you have finished the eastern wing already." James had said, "I have begun it, my lord." Lord Marston had said, "And the wall, you have seen it." James had said, "I have seen it, my lord." Lord Marston had said, "And what is your judgment?" James had been silent for a moment. He had said, "My lord, the wall is a piece of careful, competent masonry. It is structurally sound. It would, on the basis of structural condition alone, be straightforward to remove. I will give you a full written report when I have completed the rest of my survey." Lord Marston had smiled. He had said, "Excellent, Mr. Hadlow. That is what I had hoped to hear." James had said, "There is a further matter, my lord, that I will want to discuss with you when I have completed the survey." Lord Marston had raised an eyebrow. He had said, "What matter, Hadlow?" James had said, "I would prefer, my lord, to set it out fully in the report. I would ask only that you read the report carefully before you make any decision about the wall." Lord Marston had looked at him, in the careful, intelligent way of a young man who had begun to suspect that his surveyor had been spoken to. He had said, "Mrs. Cawthorne has been at you." James had said, in his careful young man's way, "I would prefer, my lord, to set out my own observations in the report." Lord Marston had nodded slowly. He had said, "Very well, Mr. Hadlow. I will read the report carefully. Continue your survey." James had said, "Yes, my lord." He had withdrawn. He had not gone back into the eastern wing that day. He had spent the rest of the morning and the afternoon on the careful, methodical survey of the rest of the house. The upper floors of the western range, the rooms above the kitchen, the small, careful attic spaces, the long, careful examination of the chimneys and the roof structures from the inside. He had taken his careful notes. He had made his careful drawings. He had gone back into the eastern wing the next day, and the day after that, and had completed his survey of the parts of it that lay on the near side of the wall. He had not, in those further visits, gone back to the small, narrow stair. He had not needed to. He had understood, after the 7th tread, what he needed to understand. He had spoken to the Dowager Lady Marston on the evening of his 4th day at the Hall, in the small drawing room before dinner, when Lord Marston had been temporarily absent. He had said, in his careful young man's way, that he had begun to understand that the wall in the eastern wing was a more substantial matter than he had at first thought, and that he wished to know whether her ladyship could tell him, from the family's history, what the wall was for. The Dowager had looked at him for some minutes before answering. She had said eventually, "Mr. Hadlow, are you asking from professional curiosity or because you understand what you have seen?" James had said, "I am asking your ladyship because I have stood 7 treads down the small stair in the upper corridor." The Dowager had nodded slowly. She had said, "Then I will tell you, Mr. Hadlow. I owe you that, since you have understood without being told." She had told him. The story she had told him was this. In the year 1781, Sir Reginald Marston, the great-grandfather of the present Lord Marston, had had an only daughter named Iseult. She had been 19 years old that year. She had been a careful, clever young woman of whom the family had been very fond. In the summer of 1781, she had fallen ill of a fever of the kind that took young people in that century, a slow fever, with a long course, that had left her bedridden for the autumn and the winter, and into the early spring of 1782. She had recovered, in the spring of 1782, in the sense that the fever had passed, and she had risen from her bed and had begun to walk again. But she had not, the dowager had said, recovered in the other sense. The young woman who had risen from the bed in March of 1782 had not, in the careful private estimation of her father and her mother and her younger brother, been Iseult. She had looked like Iseult. She had spoken like Iseult in some ways. She had remembered the things Iseult had remembered. But Sir Reginald and his wife, and the boy who had been Iseult's younger brother, had all known, in the slow, careful way that families know such things, without ever putting it into words, that the person who had risen from the bed was not their daughter and sister. She had lived in the eastern wing of the house from March of 1782 until her death in May of 1845. She had been 63 years in the eastern wing. She had not, in any of those years, married. She had not, in any of those years, left the wing. The family had cared for her. They had brought her food and her clothing and her small comforts. They had spoken with her. They had not, in any of those years, denied that she was Iseult, because to deny it would have been a thing the family could not face. But they had also not, in any of those years, treated her as if she were. In the autumn of 1782, 6 months after she had risen from the bed, Sir Reginald had built the wall. He had built it because what came down the small narrow stair at night, after Iseult had gone to bed, had not been Iseult either. The thing that had risen from the bed had been one thing. The thing that had walked the corridors of the eastern wing at night had been another thing. The two had occupied the same body, in the careful, steady way the things of that older country sometimes did, and Sir Reginald, who had been a careful, steady man, had thought it about the only thing he could do, by way of protecting his wife and his son and the rest of the household, to wall off the lower corridor of the eastern wing so that what came down the small narrow stair at night could not, at least, walk further into the house. Iseult had died in May of 1845. She had been 82 years old. Her body had been removed quietly from the eastern wing by Sir Reginald's son and grandson, and had been buried in the family plot at the small parish church a mile from the hall. But what had come down the small narrow stair at night had not been removed. Sir Reginald's son had, in the careful private notes he had left for his own son, written that he had thought, in 1845, of taking the wall down, that the body was gone, and that perhaps the other thing had gone with it. He had thought about it for a year. He had decided, in the end, not to. He had written, in the small careful hand of an old country gentleman, that he had been certain in his bones that whatever it was that walked the lower corridor at night had not gone anywhere with the body, and that the careful steady wall his father had built was the careful steady wall his son and his son's son, and so on, were going to keep standing. The dowager had finished her account. She had said, "Mr. Hadlow, my son does not believe this story. He believes it is a piece of family superstition that was useful to his great-grandfather, and that has now outlived its use. He intends to have the wall taken down. He has asked you to write a report that will give him professional cover for that decision." She had said, "I am asking you, as my husband's mother asked his great-grandfather's son, and as Mrs. Cawthorne asked you yesterday morning, to write your report in such a way that my son cannot, in good conscience, take down the wall." James had said, "Your ladyship, I will write the report I think is right. I cannot promise more than that." The dowager had nodded. She had said, "That is all I have asked of you, Mr. Hadlow." James had finished his survey on the 6th day. He had written his preliminary report in the small writing desk in his guest room over the 7th and the 8th days. He had submitted it to Lord Marston on the morning of the 9th day. He had ridden out from Marston Hall that afternoon on the same grey horse, in the same careful way he had ridden in. His report had been a careful professional document. It had given the structural condition of every part of the house. It had given his recommendations for repair and maintenance. It had stated clearly that the western range was sound and required only the careful program of maintenance any old country house required. On the eastern wing, his report had stated that the structural condition of the wing was good, that the wall in the lower corridor was sound, and that, in the careful professional opinion of the surveyor, the wall should not be taken down. He had given his reasons. He had said that the wall had been built in 1782 by a careful, competent mason, on the instructions of the owner, for reasons that the owner had recorded as substantial. He had said that 4 generations of subsequent owners had kept the wall standing on the basis of those same recorded reasons. He had said that he had himself examined the lower stair from the upper corridor, and that he had been able to confirm, on the basis of his own observation, that the original reasons for the wall remained substantive. He had not specified what those reasons were. He had said only that they were substantive in his professional opinion, and that he would be unable to authorize the wall's removal. He had signed the report. He had submitted it. He had ridden out. Lord Marston had not asked him to clarify what he had meant. Lord Marston had read the report carefully in his small library at the back of the hall on the morning James had ridden out. He had not been pleased. He had been a careful, intelligent young man who had been hoping for a different answer. But he had also been, in the careful way of the men of his family, a man who had been raised to take seriously a careful professional report submitted by a man he had hired in good faith. He had not, in the year that followed, ordered the wall taken down. James had returned to London. He had submitted his report to the firm. The firm had been satisfied. He had been given his next commission, a smaller country house in Hertfordshire, and had begun his careful work there. He had not, in the years that followed, returned to Marston Hall. He had not, in the years that followed, told anyone except his wife, to whom he had told it carefully and only once, 3 years after they were married, what he had seen and what he had understood at Marston Hall. He had heard, perhaps 15 years after his survey, from a careful colleague at the firm, that the present Lord Marston had at last, in his 50s, given the order to take the wall down. James had not asked his colleague for any further news. He had thought, when his colleague had told him, of writing to the dowager, who would have been 73 then, and asking whether she was well, and whether the wall had in fact come down, and what had followed. He had decided not to write. He had thought that whatever had followed was the family's, and that the dowager would not be helped by hearing from him. He had become a senior partner of the firm at 52. He had become its director at 61. He had retired at 68. He had spent the last 15 years of his working life surveying the country houses of the careful old families of England, and had become, in the small, careful way of a particular kind of professional man, well respected within his field. In his old age, he had kept his old surveying papers in a heavy oak chest in the small room at the back of his house where he did his reading. The chest had been well organized. The reports of his 52 years of professional work had been filed carefully by year, and within each year by client. There had been, in the chest, many hundreds of careful reports. The report on Marston Hall had been in the chest, in the file for the year 1879, in the small careful folder marked Marston Hall, Northumberland, Lord Charles Marston. He had not, in the 48 years since he had written it, opened that folder again. He had thought about it over the years. There had been times when he had been looking for some other report from that year, and had found his hand resting on the Marston Hall folder, and had thought that he might open it, and might read what he had written, and might think again about the careful young man he had been at 28. He had not opened it. He had not opened it because he had understood, all his long life, that what he had carried away from Marston Hall in the autumn of 1879 had been the careful inheritance of a knowledge, and that the knowledge, like the wall it had concerned, was best kept carefully closed. He had died at 81. In the careful, steady way an older man dies in a careful, steady house, in the spring of 1932. His son, who had inherited the chest, had honoured the small, careful instruction his father had left him in a quiet note kept in the chest's lid, that the Marston Hall folder, of all his father's many folders, was to be removed from the chest unread and burned in the small grate in the back room. The son had done as his father had asked. The folder had been burned. The careful surveyor's report on Marston Hall, Northumberland, had ended in the spring of 1932, in the small grate in the small back room of a quiet house in West London, on the day after the careful old surveyor's funeral. The wall, by then, had been taken down. What had followed at Marston Hall had been the subject of small, careful country reports in the local papers of Northumberland in the year 1907. Reports that the careful old surveyor had not read, that his son did not read, and that have, in the careful long way of small old country news, not been preserved. They are not part of this story. The careful old surveyor, who had walked 7 treads down a small narrow stair in the autumn of 1879, and had understood without being told, had carried what he had carried for the rest of his long life. That was his part. The wall had been built by Sir Reginald Marston in the autumn of 1782, and had stood for 125 years, and had been taken down in the spring of 1907 by Sir Reginald's great-great-grandson on the 17th attempt of his life to do so. What had been waiting on the other side of it, in the small narrow stair and the small chamber at the bottom, had been waiting 125 years. That was the story of the wall. The fire is good. The storm outside has not yet broken. Sleep well, friend. There is no wall in this house. There is no small narrow stair. There is only the steady sound of the wind in the dark trees, and the careful steady warmth of the small fire at our feet, and the careful steady knowledge that the small room you are in is the room you are in, and nothing else. Good night.